Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers and sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, I'm going to start this program today with a letter from a dear friend of mine who no longer is in this world. His name was David Rice. He took the name Mondo, Wapashitwa Walanga, Mondo, as people called him, and he died in prison for a crime that he and Edward Poindexter, was convicted and sentenced to life with him, did not commit. I won't go into all that, but he was so intellectually endowed that the Washington scene was one that Mondo kept apprised of, the Omaha scene, the New York scene. His mind, his curiosity never lessened simply because they had him in bars, behind bars. They could encage his body, but they could not encage his mind and his spirit. So the Lincoln Journal-Star gave him a regular slot to write a regular editorial piece. And this one was dated May 18th, 1988. And it says, "Brains Integrity, Keys to Chambers' Success," by W.M.E. Wilanga. And by the way, when Mondo died, I don't know how he arranged it or who arranged it, but an African took his ashes to the top of Kilimanjaro, which rises from the plains of the Serengeti. And when a wind came, he spread Mondo's ashes and they were dispersed in Africa pursuant to what apparently Mondo wanted. I have so much respect for this man that even though he was locked up in the Nebraska penal complex, I'm pleased that he wrote these words. And under his name is Special Correspondent. Senator Ernie Chambers, running unopposed on May 10th, received another of his many votes of confidence from the predominantly African population of district election in Omaha. Ernie is and has been so popular among his constituency that not only is it considered a foregone conclusion that he will retain his legislative seat anytime he runs, but there appears to have developed a kind of district mindset whereby it is practically considered a sacrilege for anyone to run against him. A few months ago, when Ernie announced that he was considering giving up his seat in the unicameral, there arose a groundswell of protest. Not only did people urge Ernie to remain in the legislature, but some even felt that he had no right to leave it if he chose to. That was particularly true among Ernie's African constituency. When Ernie announced that he had decided to stay in the legislature, Omaha's African community breathed a collective sigh of relief, but they were not alone. African people in Lincoln and elsewhere in this state, Latinos, Native Americans, and yes, Caucasians as well, cheered Ernie's decision. Even among those many persons who do not like Ernie's oftentimes meat cleaver wielding style and or his non-mainstream views, support for Gaddafi, opposition to Zionism, criticism of American political and economic, quote, justice, unquote, etc. Then there were those who were pleased to see that he would continue being a state legislator. How is it that this lone African member of the Nebraska Legislature has remained so consistently popular among his constituents and so respected by both his constituents and others? The two keys to Ernie's popularity and respectability are integrity and intelligence. Many of us have become very suspicious and cynical about politics and politicians, and justifiably so. What we typically see in politicians are endless double talk, style without substance, and the exercise of a philosophy of political expedience. In politics, we see unprincipled vote trading, pork barrel rolling, media packaging of candidates instead of discussion of real issues, and other such mystification and manipulation of the public. In this context, Ernie stands out as the proverbial breath of fresh air, a principled person among pawns for corporations and their lobbyists, a person who speaks his mind among those who become expert at saying what they think people want to hear, a thinking person among those whose minds seem only capable of reproducing cliches. Even in something as seemingly unimportant as clothing, Ernie has shown himself to be someone out of the political ordinary. In refusing to trade in his t-shirt, actually, it's a sweatshirt, for a suit and tie, Ernie has made use of symbolism to manifest his rejection of the racism, greed, and amorality that present Euro-American society is characterized by. In short, Ernie is so popular and so respected because he is being the kind of person many of us might like to be, but simply don't have the courage to become. That wasn't just to boast, it's to bring forth a contrast. All the time I was in the legislature, I was guided by what it is that I believe, not what other people thought, not what they expected, not what they demanded. And as far as the clothing that I wear and wore then and down through the years, if it was good enough for the people who gave me my living while I was a barber, it's good enough for anybody. And if they didn't like it, they didn't have to look at me. When I first went down there, they thought that they could put me in my place by treating me the way they thought Black men should be treated, I suppose. One senator, and this was written about in an article, he was rotund, that means large, said that perhaps they ought to start thinking about a dress code. And then, as the article pointed out, Senator Chambers immediately rose to his feet when that man sat down and said, if you're going to impose a dress code, include in that the idea that these senators need to wear deodorant. And I looked at the fat guy who had stood up and made the comment, and for some reason, there was never any mention of a possible dress code anymore. And I couldn't always tell that they had accepted the hint about using deodorant. But I was in that legislature, not of that legislature. I was going to be in that place what I was in my community, even more so. And my giving, I didn't take an oath. I gave an affirmation, a promise that I would do to the best of my ability those things that a person in the legislature would do. And to me, that meant anybody, male, female, old, young, Black, white, Native, Latinx, Jew, Gentile, Catholic, all of these labels. Have you noticed? Not one of the labels that I've used was produced by Black people. White people are the ones who label and package people and then treat them negatively accordingly. I didn't care about the labels. All I cared about was the fact that this is a human being. And if that human being, regardless of all these labels, fell within a realm where when I gave that affirmation, I would look out for those kind of people because of the injustice they suffered, that's what I would do. I've got stacks of letters. I didn't realize I was accumulating them. I guess the lady who worked with me didn't throw them away. But going back to shortly after I got in the legislature, people saying they had never seen anybody like me, that they would call on me when their own senator would not even take their call, things that might seem incredible, meaning unbelievable. They did not expect that I would be the kind of man that I am. They expected me to be the kind of person they would be were they in my situation. where the labels that are attached to people would dictate how they treated that person. I don't have enough confidence in the judgment of other people when it comes to judging others to accept at face value what they say about somebody else. I would tell everybody that if there's going to be any contact between you and me, you will set the tone, and nobody can treat me better than I will treat them. Consequently, I was the one that people turned to when there was no place else to turn, nobody who would even listen. For those who saw Star Wars, there was a guy, he was kind of a mystic, and he went by the label Obi-Wan Kenobi. And whenever people got in trouble, they summoned him, and he could appear anywhere in the universe in Star Wars. They traveled a lot faster in different ways from what we do in reality. So some people were on this planet that was about to be destroyed. And this lady, Princess Leia, looked at it and gave the plea, help us, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're our only hope. In Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi was the only hope of those in the universe who needed it. In this world, Catholics have designated St. Jude as the saint of the hopeless down here. Well, everybody runs low on occasion. So one day, Obi-Wan and St. Jude got together, and they approached me and said, help us, oh Ernie, you're our only hope. We exist in fiction. We exist in mythology. You exist as a living, breathing human being in this physical world. There's no way, St. Jude said, that Obi-Wan can help these people. Obi-Wan said, there's no way that St. Jude can help these people, but you can, and we hope that you will, that you'll be better than the people we're asking you to help. And I said, I don't judge people in terms of being better or more worthy. People are not always the conduct that they engage in. People are weak. People are frightened. People lack confidence. They fear controversy. They fear conflict. They lack self-confidence. They don't believe in their own judgment, so they seek the approval of others. They try to keep a low profile, out of sight, so that if blows are to be struck, none of them will strike such people. So if they see somebody they perceive as being strong, they'll line up behind that person, not to give assistance, but to be protected. This is not boasting. It's what I have come to believe from observation. And there's advice given to people who want to write novels or histories or anything else. Write what you know about. I know about people. I have been dealt with in a way that nobody in Nebraska has ever been dealt with. Each person could say that because each person has different experiences, but I mean it in a bigger and broader sense. No politician has ever been treated the way I have. No politician who was ever in the legislature had been there as long as I have been and will ever have a chance to be there as long as I have. You see, I've been memorialized in the white people's Constitution. They write their laws with a pencil that has a very long eraser. And if a black man such as me comes along who will not fit the mold that they have fashioned for black men, they just erase what the law is and write something different. So instead of holding to the notion that anybody who is born or naturalized in this country is a citizen and therefore can run for office if he or she has not been disqualified through commission of a felony or some other disability, he or she can run for office and stay there as long as the voters want to keep him or her there. Well, when it became obvious to these white people that black people are intelligent, black people are concerned about what is in their own best interest, and consequently continue to send me back there among those heathens to do the work that needed to be doing to the extent that one man could. So what these white people did was change their constitution and thereby memorialized me in their constitution. Their provision in their constitution, known as term limits, should be called the Ernie provision, because everybody, students, professors, politicians, editors, journalists, know that term limits were put in place because of me and to get me out of office. White people acknowledged that one Black man was superior to 48 white men and women. Yet I never talked about Black supremacy in the sense of it being a genetic thing. I pointed out unashamedly the mistreatment I received at the hands of white people when I was a small child in grade school. Now, white people don't want their actual history to be taught because they say it will make little white children feel ashamed. Well, if they're ashamed, it's not because Black people are talking about critical race theory. It's because these little white people are shown that people such as themselves, people they've told are great, were slaveholders, human traffickers, sexual abusers of Black men, women, and children, murderers, lynchers, Ku Klux Klanners, all of that. So they think, these white people, that they should coat that over and not even talk about it. They weren't worried about a little Black boy in the lower grades at Lothrop School who had to endure having the story Little Black Sambo read by a white teacher while the other little white children were allowed to laugh. It made them no difference that in music, the song they loved to sing was Old Black Joe. They didn't worry about high school kids of my complexion having to read a play by Eugene O'Neill called Emperor Jones, and the N-word was used throughout. One of their supposedly great writers, Mark Twain, named a character the N-word, and we had to read it. Where was the concern about one helpless, outnumbered Black child who would have self-respect, self-worth demolished forever if white people had their way about it? But for some reason, somehow, it didn't destroy me. It didn't make me afraid. It didn't make me bow down before white people. It put in me a determination to the extent that something can be determined by a small child, that it's not going to be this way forever. One day I'll be as big physically as these white people who are doing these things to me and have done them to people like me. And I told the people in the legislature on several occasions, if you all hadn't mistreated that Black child who didn't know how to fight, who couldn't fight the way you mistreated him, you wouldn't have to deal with the Black man that you deal with now, and you fear so much that you alter the rules of your legislature that you own. You outnumber this one Black man 48-1, and he uses your rules to beat you at your own game. And you can write the rules any way you chose, and that's what they did. They wrote rules to limit debate, but it crippled them, but not me, because they could limit the debate on a specific issue, but they didn't limit the number of issues that could be raised. So I knew how to make every kind of motion that was in the rule book and every kind of motion I could create that hadn't been written, but it fell within the province of what the rules allowed. And if I wanted to tie that legislature up from 8 in the morning till midnight, I could do it, and I had done it. They marveled to an extent more than I thought they did at the fact that I never went to the bathroom when I was in the legislature on the floor debating one of my issues or stopping one of their issues. From the moment that we started at 9 in the morning until we were compelled by law to adjourn at midnight, because if we were there 1 minute after midnight, that became a legislative day that was gone. I didn't leave the floor. I didn't sit down in my chair. I didn't use notes. I was like somebody or something they had never encountered before. And since they couldn't cope with me, then they had to find a way to get rid of me. They were not going to murder me. For some reason, they thought if they did something bad to me, the police or any white person, Black people in Omaha would respond in a way that white people didn't want to see Black people respond. And nobody dared put his hands on me. And I'd quote that statement we had as children, a small piece of leather, but well put together. And I had about 250 pounds of weights in the office and a weight bench. And when reporters were there, sometimes I'd get under about 220 pounds and we'd be talking and I'd be pressing it, put 45 pounds on each dumbbell and be alternating, curling and talking like I'm talking to you now. And it was to make a point to them that if you put your hands on me, then you better know what it is that you're doing and be prepared for the consequences. I won't put my hands on you first. And one time somebody asked me that when I was in a sour mood because of what they said. And they said, well, Ernie, it might be advantageous for you to put your hands on a white person first. Why do you say you won't do it? I said, I don't want to be contaminated. White people have rare exotic diseases. And even though they have all the hospitals, the scientists, the medicines, their diseases they can't cope with, and they're among white people. I say, now maybe that's a curse on you from your God. Maybe your being white, as you call yourself, is a curse. The sun is the source of light and life. Plants flourish because of sunlight. Without light, they can't live. There can be no photosynthesis. But if you're in the sunlight, you burn, as you call it. You get skin cancer. That which gives life and health to other living things give you the most dread disease that white people could get, skin cancer. And white people, for some reason, don't like it when one Black man gives in small measure that of which they heap upon us from little children on upward. You know why they could make Black men shuffle, put their head down, not make eye contact with white people? Because white people could always get a mob together and take that person's life after torturing that person. They would castrate Black men alive. All these so-called pro-life people who think that no woman should have an abortion regardless of anything. There are recorded examples of pregnant Black women being taken out and beaten until the fetus was expelled. Then if there was any life in it, they deliberately would crush the skull. This is white people's history, and they don't want it taught. It's in their books. There were contemporaneous, and that means at the time something happened, accounts of it given. Governor Bradford, I shouldn't tell you what colony he was the governor of, but Massachusetts. There were Native people all over this country. And you know what those Christians would do? They would cut the heads off Native people and kick them in the streets. This was described by the colonists. And they were made to know that there are certain parts of town where they cannot take the severed heads of these natives and fry them, not to eat them, although sometimes they did eat dead bodies. And there are records of white people out in the wilderness acknowledging that things had gotten so bad that they would bury a corpse this morning and dig it up before the sunset in order to have food. White people committed cannibalism. So there are some people who know about the Donner expedition in Colorado for white people engaged in cannibalism. You cannot undo history by just covering it up. You can learn from it. You can resolve not to repeat those things, but it's wrong to do what these white people are trying to do. See, all that history does, it serves as a mirror and reflects to anybody who looks in that mirror whatever object is in front of the mirror. So white people, not liking what they see reflected in that mirror, will take a stone and destroy it and say, we're not going to have some things taught in the schools. We're not going to allow certain books to be read. Not that the books are untrue, but the truer they are to the facts that occurred, the more white people don't want those things read. But they did not prevent me from reading books. I read their books. I mastered their English. And when I went to Creighton, out of Tech High, which was supposed to be a dumb school, tech was for technical. You can learn about auto mechanics, woodworking, printing, the things that you needed to know how to do to make a living. I didn't take a lot of those courses, but I read a lot. And when I went to Creighton, they had entrance examinations. I scored so high on my entrance exam, and you can take it or leave it, that I was placed in what was called honors English. You know what that meant? That I understood the language that white people spoke and wrote better than the vast majority of them. And I was placed in what was called honors English. I feel like I'm going to sneeze. And I didn't attend classes. I sat out on a wall. The Creighton campus was a lot different from what it is now. California ran all the way from 16th or wherever it started up past 30th. But now the campus has been built like any other campus, and streets don't go all the way through. But anyway, outside the administration building on California Street was a wall, not quite waist high. And I'd sit out on that wall all day. And white students, white professors, priests would come and sit down and talk to me, or rather listen. And there I was, a relative youngster who did not attend classes. And I did not know that it was really something out of the ordinary to carry 18 hours when you were in college. You get an hour for each hour you spend in class. It was nothing for me to carry that many hours. And by the time I became a senior, I had so many hours that I just stopped going to classes altogether. And at Creighton, you had to take oral exams in whatever your major was. Mine was in history. So they had 4 or 5 white men sitting around a table. There were no women teaching up there. There were nuns, but they were students, and they cringed and cowered and didn't look anybody in the eye. And I forget the questions that they asked me. I don't know whether I passed those oral exams or not, because they probably would have been so happy to have me off that campus that they would have passed me if I didn't answer a single question. But not every professor was that way. There was one who taught biology, actually zoology. His name was Alan Schlesinger, and he was one of the sharpest people that I had ever encountered. And he taught by examples. We were in a large, it wasn't large enough to be an auditorium, but it was much larger than an ordinary classroom. And it was in a semicircle, and there may have been 6 or 7 rows. And it was large enough for him to have a microphone. It was on a string about that tall and about that big around, and it hung just below his neckline and he'd talk. So he was discussing how human beings, like other animals, adjust and adapt to their environment. So he was talking and talking, and every now and then he would, no, he didn't have to, he didn't control the mic up there. He had something in his hand. You know what that scamp had done? By the time the class was half over, he had turned off the microphone entirely. But he had done it so gradually, people didn't notice it, and I guess they would strain to hear what he said. They said, it's not true. If you put a frog in cold water, you can boil him by gradually turning up the heat, and he'd never jump out and he'd boil to death before he jumped out. Those are the kind of things people would say. But Schlesinger had a way of demonstrating things. So not only did I learn from what he said, I learned from the way he said it, the way he ran the class, the way he maintained and held the interest of the students. Subsequent to my having been there, he never said it to me directly. He told people, and it was written in some publication, that I was the most stimulating student he had ever had. He said honor, or pleasure, something like that, of having in his class, because he and I would have conversations after class. And I would ask the kind of questions that would please somebody like him. But at any rate, because I went to these schools, not necessarily that I was welcomed there, but I knew that that was where I could get knowledge and information. I spent endless hours in the library stacks. I would be there until the library closed. People knew if I wasn't out sitting on the wall, lecturing, talking, I'd be in the stacks reading. I read all kinds of books about all kinds of subjects, if they were well written, because I was interested in language, words, the way people expressed what it was they were trying to say. And if I could read a description and visualize in my mind what was being described, that to me was a good writer. Maybe the writer was a hack to somebody else, but I was looking for something else to derive from language and words. Well, now that I've taken all that time digressing in a way, I'm coming back to a point that I started making. I have been memorialized in the White People's Constitution of Nebraska. I am better known around the country and the world probably than most living Nebraskans ever would be. When I got the death penalty passed, the Colosseum in Rome was lighted up and a huge banner was put across the front of it that said, "Congratulations, Nebraska, for abolishing the death penalty." That was because of a Black man, not any white people. When an editorial was written in the largest newspaper of South Africa, the Rand Daily Mail, that something happened in America that can start a bandwagon effect that will ultimately lead to the dismantling or destruction of apartheid, they weren't writing about white people. They were writing about something that a Black man had done. When there was an international conference in Italy of people who were, they were called atheists, naturalists, any and everything, even people who call themselves believers in Italy, to talk about something that happened in America that they had not seen before. And it was something done by a Black man in Nebraska. A lawsuit had been filed against God, and it was written like a serious lawsuit. Plaintiff versus defendant, allegations, a request for a remedy. And I was that person, and I received an invitation, a special invitation, but I wouldn't go because maybe I'm part vampire. I don't like large bodies of water. I don't want to fly over it. I don't want to be on a ship on top of it. So I thanked them, but didn't go. when an invitation was extended to a legislator by the French embassy in Washington, D.C., that person was a Black man, and it's the one who is talking to you now. No legislator other than me was ever invited to address an assembly of the United Nations, but I was. I testified before a congressional committee when they were considering what was called Defense of Marriage Act. And they wanted to say that if same-sex marriage was legal in one state and people so married went to another state, that marriage didn't have to be recognized if the state they went to didn't recognize it. Well, marriage is a contract, and there's a contract clause in their constitution, which they don't know and don't pay attention to, where there could be no violation of or abrogation of contracts. But Congress, these white people were going to do it. So because they knew that I had fought for the rights of gay and lesbian people, by the way, I wasn't always one who was concerned about people like that. When I was growing up, I was made to be afraid of them. I didn't know what a punk was. In all those days, a punk was a homosexual. You all probably didn't know that. I didn't know what a lady was called who liked other women. But there were such people, and we were taught to be afraid of them. They didn't look different, but if I knew that somebody was one of those, I did have kind of a fear, and I'd stay away from them. And I didn't know why I was to be afraid of them. But I knew if there was a man who they say walked funny or had a limp wrist, look out. And if there was a woman who wore a man's clothes and cut her hair short, look out. When I first went to the legislature, I didn't have ideas that backward, but I still had a negative attitude toward people who were gay if they were men, lesbian if they were women. I didn't mistreat anybody, but I didn't feel comfortable. But then when I began to read articles and see how badly these people were treated, they weren't just left alone like I left them alone. They were beaten, they were tortured, they were murdered, and I felt that that was wrong. These people never bothered me. I didn't even know what they did that made them so horrible, but whatever it was, they never tried to do it to me. So I didn't have any natural, as you might call it, hatred for these people or desire to see bad things happen to them. I saw people who, because of what they were, could be murdered and nothing would be done about it. And that there were such people in Nebraska, and they could not get jobs. They could not get a place to stay if people didn't want to give them a job or a place to stay. So I started pushing legislation to protect their rights. But I cannot take credit for having offered the first legislation. There's a white man named Tim Hall. We became very close in terms of working in the legislature. He had one of these kind of people in his district who asked him to bring a bill that would put gay and lesbian people among the protected classes of groups in Nebraska. But because I knew the way people felt about those people, and Tim was, I felt, a friend as much as I could be a friend to a white person. I said, Tim, you shouldn't bring that bill by yourself because people are going to be against you like they're against the ones you're trying to help. So I'm going to put my name on the bill with you. And from then on, I became the strongest advocate. And that doesn't make me a hero. It doesn't make me anything other than a decent person who would want to see others treated the way that I wanted to be treated. When they were going to put one of these camps, boot camps as they called it, out in one of those Western cities, I got a provision in the law that would say that you couldn't have a company building, doing that work if they had a discriminatory policy against people based on sexual orientation. I talked about it so much that eventually it wound up in the lawyer's code. There can be no discrimination because of all these things or sexual orientation, and judges could not do that. But one judge did violate that principle by refusing to allow an adoption by two women who were married. I filed a complaint. The Judicial Qualifications Commission threw it out. That was months ago, but I'm working on writing a response and going to reveal and expose what they said because their answers are supposed to be confidential. That means secret. And the Bible said they hated the light and loved darkness, for their deeds were evil. So that is a constituency that I felt obliged to do all I could to help. That was why I was invited to this congressional committee like no member of the legislature ever had been. And I gave my strong views about how wrong their attitudes were. And they asked me, well, if you believe that people of the same sex should marry, do you think that there should be multiple marriages by somebody? I said, well, as you know, there was a state where that was done until it was outlawed. It was called polygamy. And they said, well, how do you feel about that? I said, I don't feel anything about it. But I'll tell you what I did read one time about a Muslim who was in charge of a country, and he could have had multiple wives, but he chose not to. And they asked him why. He said, it's not that I don't like women. He said, but there's no way that a man could have several wives and not eventually settle on one more than the others, and they would detect that, and it would bring about confusion. So since a man could not have all of these women and treat them all exactly the same, it was not a wise thing for a leader to do. So he had only one wife. His was based on intelligence. So that was how I answered the question about multiple wives. And then I said, but it's an odd thing that you all are talking from a position of morality, but the state that one of your fellow congresspersons come from recognizes what they call cohabiting. In other words, if two people live together long enough as man and wife, then they're recognized under the law as being married. And they went through no formal ceremony, but it was their relationship that created the rights of married people and the obligations. So on the one hand, you're going to tell these children how they're supposed to be chaste and wait till marriage to have sex and so forth, and don't deal with somebody of the same sex, yet your state recognizes that if people live in what y'all call sin long enough, then that sin no longer is sinful. I said, that's how irrational all this stuff is. You ought to learn to leave people alone. You ought to all get off crotch watch. I said, and if you didn't get it, crotch watch. Don't you be so concerned about what other people do with their crotches. Just take care of your own. But they passed such a law anyway. And guess what happened? The United States Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. So I, the nut from Nebraska, who was invited to testify before the committee, maybe they thought they would have a gay old time with, I shouldn't say gay, a fun time with me because I had to be ignorant. But they got a notion of how I conduct myself and how my mind runs, how their badges and titles meant nothing to me. On the desk in front of each person or the table was a name tag with the abbreviation HON period and then the name. Well, that stands for honorable. They can't write all that on there. But before I went there, about a month or so, I had read about this Black woman who worked in the cafeteria. the congressional cafeteria. And she, as older Black women tend to do on occasion, will refer to everybody as honey, but some of the white men took offense at it and they had her disciplined. I don't remember whether they fired her or not, but as I was talking, I said, oh, I said, I see that HON in front of each one of your name. I'm proud of you for that. And they looked, and I mentioned what had happened to this Black woman. I said, so obviously the word honey addressed to you is no longer offensive. And to let everybody know that you're not offended when you're addressed as honey, you put it as a part of your official name, honey. And then somebody said, well, that doesn't stand for honey. I said, you think I don't know that? I said, it stands for honorable, whether the one who has it before his or her name can even spell the word. It's routine. It's a word that doesn't mean anything. I said, in fact, it reminds me of something. There was this Black gentleman who was testifying in court, and we are respected nowhere. The honorifics of Mr., Miss, Mrs. are not allowed or are not acceptable when a Black person is being addressed. So this Black man was sitting on the witness stand, and the judge looked at him, old white judge. He said, I understand they call you Colonel. Is that right? And the Black man said, yes, Your Honor, they call me that. He said, well, I don't know why they would call you Colonel, although you're not old enough. Then he stopped. He said, you wouldn't have been in the Second World War, but you're too young to have gotten that title if you were in some other branch of the service. He said, so why did they call you Colonel? He said, well, Judge, Your Honor, the Colonel in front of my name is just like the honorable in front of your name. It don't mean nothing. And as in that song, Bad, Bad Leroy Brown, a hush fell over the pool room. Well, a hush fell over that room. Then there were a few giggles that were heard. And that let them know the kind of Black man that they were dealing with. But I did study their law. I studied their constitution. And I knew that that provision they were bringing was not only immoral, it would be illegal. As it turned out, I had read their white Supreme Court correctly, and that so-called DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, was struck down as unconstitutional. Not only was no white legislator invited, but no white legislator would have said the things that I said. So I've been around the blocks a few times. I've had invitations of the kind that nobody from Nebraska has received, but it hasn't gone to my head in the way it will to white people. What it does with me is create a type of simmering anger that a person has to be so far and away more outstanding than white people just to be treated halfway like a human being. And then it's not out of respect, it's out of fear. Lets me know what a hateful, backward, immoral place America is. Their flag indeed is a rag. They don't even know how it is to be displayed. White people, the master race, do not know. When you're looking at a flag, the flag, when it's being looked at, they call it the Union. The stars over here should always be to the left of the person looking at it. And it's called the Union because each time another state is added, it's added to the Union, and it will be a star. The original 13 stripes will never be added to. But where the field of stars is, called the Union, is to always be on the left of the person observing. So if I have a flag and you have them on military uniforms and police officers can wear them, otherwise, under the US code, they're not to be a part of any clothing, but you see the flag on all kind of garments. Then they had the nerve to get mad because a football player took a knee when they were playing the national anthem to honor the flag. It's all to always be to the left of the one looking at it. But when they wear it on their uniforms, even on that helicopter that the president flies in, the stars are on the wrong side. They're to the right of the one looking at that helicopter, and that is backward. White people don't even know how to fly that rag themselves. It specifically says that it is never to be unfurled or spread horizontally. You know what horizontally means? Like the horizon. It should never be laid out flat. But at these big sporting events called football, they'll have a huge flag rolled up from one side of the field to the other. They have military people, cops, and others unfurling that flag. How? Horizontally, which is where it's not supposed to be. The US code says a flag should never be part of an athletic uniform. All during the basketball tournaments, they wore flags. They wear flags on football uniforms. The referees wear flags, and they're always backward. But it also says a flag should never come in contact with the ground. But when you got a flag on your helmet or on your uniform and you hit the ground, the flag is on the ground. They don't see that as being wrong. This is how crazy, how irrational white people are. And now by me telling the truth about them, they'll say, I'm preaching hatred. You know why they call it hatred when I tell the truth? Because a black man is not to speak about white people like this. They would rather I curse them out than tell the truth about them, because the truth about them is worse than any curse word I could contrive to describe them. How about all those things? And if you think I'm not telling the truth, from my study of history, I know the importance of documentation, sources, and so forth. Go to the US code. I don't know if they have a copy at the library, the public library, but they'd have one. If you can use the library, due to the pandemic, you may not be able to. Maybe you can find it on what I call the gadget, the computer. Look up the US code under the flag, and you'll see all the requirements of it. By the way, it's not to be used as a part of an advertisement either, but it's on garbage trucks. They put it on underwear, all the things that it says don't. But then when these black men and some white men with them took a knee when the so-called national anthem was played, everybody was outraged because it was disrespecting that rag. But when the Ku Klux Klan came, they had the rag. At all of the lynchings, they flew the rag. And I'm supposed to honor a rag when every time I've seen it, it's been a symbol of oppression for black people, not just being called names or told you can't drink water, but your life would be taken just because of what you are, not for anything you did. And that is the history of this country. This country was built on slavery. I'm working on a piece that I'm going to send to the World Herald to show that when these white people, they don't know what critical race theory is anyway. But to make it simple, if anything, they'd love it because it doesn't make individuals responsible for their racism. What it says is that racism is embedded in the systems that comprise this country, in the legal system, business, and everywhere. It's almost like giving individual white people a pass that you're the way you are, not because you're a bad person, but the system of which you're a part inculcates that into you. It makes you behave a certain way because of the way it operates, the principles, if you want to call them that, according to which it functions, requires this kind of treatment of Black people by you. You're a good person, but the system of which you're a part is bad. And for you to function in that system, you have to follow its rules. Critical race theory doesn't relate to individuals. That's why it's stated that critical race theory is not found in elementary schools, it's not found in high schools, it's not even found in some lower level university grades, and not on some campuses at all. It's up there in the higher realms, the higher reaches of academia. You all who are white are so ignorant and show how ignorant you are by saying things that are not true because somebody whose word you take will tell you this is gospel truth. And like a parrot, you're really quite dense. You remember the words, but you don't get the sense. And then you hate somebody like me who's trying to bring you understanding, who will tell you and can tell you, don't do what I say, do what I do. White people are supposed to be my enemy, but they got better treatment from me when it came to governmental action than any white person who'd ever been in the legislature. There was a white woman who wanted to be a trooper, and they had to get a physical. And this doctor, when he gave women a physical, he'd make them lay down on their back and spread their crotches, spread their legs, and he gave a pelvic exam. I found out about it and I filed a formal complaint against him, but the Health and Human Services Department wouldn't do anything about him. The woman did testify one time before the Judiciary Committee. I asked, had we ever talked to each other before? She said, no. I said, you're aware of the complaint I filed because of the way you were treated? She said, yes. I said, did you ask me to do that? She said, no, but I appreciate the fact that you did it. You're a Black man speaking out for a white woman who's being handled in that way by white men. Then they talk about critical race theory being something that their children shouldn't be exposed to. Well, they're not going to be exposed to it anyway. That's how dumb these white people are. White people are dumb. They are mentally stunted because the system of education keeps them ignorant. And they're trained to accept whatever these people tell them, like trained monkeys. Monkey see, monkey do. It was difficult for me to be in that legislature. And I did speak with contempt toward them. And I said, I'll do it because you're in a position to talk back to me. I don't own you. You're not working for me. I can't fire you. You can stand on this floor and give back what I'm giving to you. But before you do it, you better know that I've got more in store. And white people would write letters to the Pulse. Why won't they stand up to him? Why does they let him bully them? And then they blame me because the other senators were afraid of me. And I'm supposed to cower and not do what I can get done through that legislature for the people I care about because they are put in fear. If fear is what it takes to get them to do the right thing, I have a biblical verse for everything. There's a verse in the Bible that says, some save by fear. So if it takes fear, then fear is here. If we can have a rational reasonable discussion, that's the way we will deal. And on the points where we differ, we'll lay them aside until we found all of the points where we agree. Then we can lay them aside and see if we can come together on these things that we disagree on. And if we can't, are we going to let the whole thing sink, or will we forget for the time being these things we disagree on and take these things we do agree on and let them become the bill? And that's what we will enact into the law. That's the way I operated. It's why, even though a lot of them hated me, they respected me. And it's why they knew that even though we fought like scorpions in the bottle in the morning, if they came to me with an issue that dealt with the integrity of the legislature as an institution, or would help some group that I feel needs our help, then they could get my support. And I could defend their bill better than they could. Generally, the bill was given to them by somebody else, and they were given a cheat sheet, so to speak, but mine came from here. I knew. I didn't have to read. I didn't have to go out in the lobby to ask somebody, how am I to answer this question? I, a lot of times, would present the issue so that there would be no questions. And you know how I would arrive at that position? I would take this issue and I would look at it as somebody who is opposed to it and find every flaw in it that I'd be able to find. And then I would smooth those things out so that it met not their standards, but met my standards. But if they raised the issue, I had already dealt with it, and I dealt with it against somebody more intelligent than they ever would be, because the one I had dealt with on it was myself. And I know the issue. There was no question they could ask that I had not anticipated and did not have an answer for. And I did spend more time in that legislature and down in that Capitol building and the law library than any senator who had ever been in office or any person who'd been in public office. Not to impress people, but to satisfy that one friend that I've got that's deep down inside of me, who knows when I've done the best that I can, who knows when I've done what I ought to do. And I would be lying if I said that every second of every minute of every hour of every day of every week of every month of every year of every decade of every score, I'd always done what my better angels told me to do. I would be lying. If I said I never got angry, I'd be lying. Here's what I look at. The Bible said anger rests in the bosom of a fool. Anger in and of itself is not foolish, because there could be something that elicits anger justifiably. But if you let it rest there and simmer there, then you're a fool, because you're killing yourself. If it's a motive force, like fuel, that stimulates you to act, to correct what is making you angry, then anger is a good thing. I heard my grandmother say something that settled something for me as a child that I didn't know how to frame into a question. You can go to hell for thinking wicked thoughts, but sometimes thoughts come unbidden, especially when you're a child. And as soon as they tell you don't, that's what you do. So one time she was talking and she said, when you're thinking, thoughts are like birds. You cannot stop them from flying over your head, but you can stop them from building a nest in your hair. And that eureka light, I have found it, went on in my young mind. I cannot stop these thoughts from coming and these feelings, but I don't have to welcome them. I don't have to nurture them, and I don't have to let them take charge of me. When you can overcome yourself, then the rest of the world is like duck soup. When you have an unruly spirit that controls you, you're like that driverless car that ordinarily does what it's built to do. But in this instance, it would not respond to anything in the way it should. And this man was on a highway going 85 miles an hour and he couldn't stop the car, couldn't slow it down. And he was using his camera to record it because he said in case he and his passengers didn't survive, people would know that it was through no fault of their own. He had enough thoughtfulness. And I guess in his mind was the people who would remain. How would it reflect on them if I drove crazily like this? But as it turned out, the thing wound up, he somehow engaged the brake or something and was able to get it off the highway. So don't let certain things control you. Set up in your mind, for your sake, what it is you believe is right for you to do. Believe in yourself, trust your own judgment, never give up, and never quit. A term they used to apply to me was relentless. Relenting means that you yield, you give up. If you will not resent, if you will not give up, if you will not relent, then you're relentless. It means you're going to continue striving and pushing, and nothing and nobody is going to turn you aside with threats or whatever. All of those 46 years, I never carried a gun or a knife or had bodyguards. I even went to hostile cities. Some of them had done terrible things to Black people. There was an interracial couple in Norfolk or one of those kind of places, and some Klan people. Yeah, they carried crosses and had pillowcases and paraded up and down in front of their houses, and the police would do nothing. So I went out to that town by myself, and they didn't parade around me, and they knew I was coming. When I got threats from Norfolk, I do know that. And that's the time I put the bullseye on my shirt and gave advance notice and then went out there. And Dan and some of the other guys, Tariq and other Black men, told me that I shouldn't do that. And if I had to do it, I should take somebody with me. I said, no, it's enough for me to try to look out for myself, but all you all would do probably is get in my way, and you couldn't help me. So I don't want to put somebody into a bad situation based on what I believe. When we would participate in demonstrations during the years when there was what they called nonviolent demonstrations, the things that happened to Black people would never happen to white people. The cops could beat you openly with a club if you were a student or a woman. They turned fire hoses on you so strong that they would have you rolling down the street, women and children. They could set police dogs on you. These vicious, white, racist Christians. And it was broadcast all over the world. This is what the land of the free and the home of the brave does to Black people. Non-offending, harmless, non-violent people doing what they're doing because promises were made to them by these white people about it being the land of the free and the home of the brave, but they forgot to say. So they would teach us by object lesson. You're not a citizen in this country. You are a resident in this country, but you're not a citizen. You don't have the rights and privileges of what a citizen would have. So don't get beside yourself and think of yourself as an American. So I don't call myself an American. I don't call myself a citizen. But as long as I'm here, I demand the rights that they say a citizen has because I was born in this country. And that's enough for a white person to be a citizen. And if you're naturalized in a country, that means you come from someplace else and they let you come here. And that's what white people do, and they let white people come here. They're talking about opening the gates to all these Ukrainians because they're white. But a young Black man who is here as a refugee was thrown down by a stop. You all saw it on the news. A cop chased him, car not properly registered, and it resulted in him getting shot in the back of the head. Well, some people say, well, he was tussling with the cop and trying to get the cop's taser, but the cop was on top of him. And if the cop had to take the gun and had to shoot him, he could have shot him in a place where it wouldn't kill him. He on top put that gun to the young man, the back of the young man's head, and pulled the trigger. That was one of the ways they executed people in a mob. And nothing will be done to the cop. And we're supposed to love America. And I'm supposed to say it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. I'm supposed to salute a flag, a rag. It is a symbol of our oppression. Wherever you see an American flag, if you're Black, beware. The cops who dragged Rosa Parks off the bus had on flag emblems. That's what the American flag means. And when the Klan came to burn people's houses down, rape the women, they carried the flag. I think my time is probably up. So I'm going to say what the canary said when he found out the door was open. I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.